My daughter-in-law told me my only son was dead, then gave me 4 days to get out. She thought I was just a grieving old woman. I pretended to cry, but I was secretly recording everything. The police arrived. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The news of my son's death arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the one person I had never fully trusted. I was in my study, a room that was less a part of the house and more a museum of my life. The walls were lined with books on criminal psychology and forensic science. Souvenirs from a 30-year career as a homicide detective. On the mantelpiece, a framed photo of my late husband Samuel. His smile as warm and bright as the day I'd met him stood next to a picture of our only son David, his arm around me at his college graduation. The house was quiet, as it always was now. The silence was a constant, low hum of absence, a reminder of the two most important people in my life. The husband I had lost to cancer 5 years ago, and the son who was the living, breathing center of my world. The doorbell rang, a sharp, jarring sound that was an intrusion on the quiet afternoon. I opened it to find my daughter-in-law, Isabel, standing on my porch. She was a vision of frantic theatrical grief. Her usually perfect makeup was artfully smudged. Her beautiful, expensive clothes looked as though she had been wrestling with a ghost. "Martha," she gasped, her voice a high, reedy sob, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, Martha. It's David." I felt a cold metallic dread instantly flood my veins. A feeling I hadn't felt since the day I'd gotten the call about Samuel. "What about David?" I asked, my own voice a low, gravelly thing I barely recognized. "Is he okay?" She collapsed into my arms, a gesture that was so out of character for the cool, reserved Izzy. I knew that it was the first red flag. She was a real estate agent, one of the top in the city, a woman whose entire life was a performance of cool, calculated success. This display of raw, uncontrolled emotion was off. "There was an accident," she wept into my shoulder, her sobs feeling strangely hollow, too rhythmic. "A car accident. He was on a business trip, up near Seattle, a logging truck. It lost control. He was killed instantly. He's gone, Martha. Our David is gone. I am a 72-year-old woman. I have a heart that my doctor charitably calls temperamental, and I had just been told that my only son, the sole remaining pillar of my life, was dead. The room, the world, should have dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos of pure, unadulterated pain, and a part of it did. A great, gaping and very real wound opened in my soul. I stumbled back, leaning against the doorframe, the performance of a devastated, heartbroken mother requiring very little acting. But another part of me, a part that had been dormant since I'd turned in my badge, woke up. It was the detective. The cold, analytical observer who had spent a lifetime listening to lies, to half-truths, to the carefully constructed fictions of people who had something to hide. And as I held my sobbing daughter-in-law, my detective's mind, a cold, clear and very quiet voice in the back of my head, whispered a single terrible and deeply suspicious thought. "This is a performance, and it's not a very good one." I led Izzy into the living room and sat her down on the sofa, a piece of furniture Samuel and I had bought together 30 years ago. I played my part. I was the grieving, shattered old woman, my movements slow, my voice a choked, disbelieving whisper. I made us tea, my hands shaking, a tremor that was only partly an act. "Tell me everything," I said, sitting in the armchair opposite her. "The police, who did you talk to? Which hospital is he at?" My questions were the natural, frantic inquiries of a grieving mother. But they were also the first, probing questions of a detective beginning an investigation. I needed details, names, jurisdictions, facts. And that was where her story, her beautiful, tragic and deeply flawed story, began to unravel. "It was the state police," she said, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. "A trooper, Smith. I think his name was. He called me an hour ago. He said it was on the I-5, just south of the city. A terrible, multi-car pileup." I nodded, my mind filing the information away. Trooper Smith, I-5, state police. Vague, but plausible. "The hospital," I pressed. "Where did they take him? I need to see my boy." Her face for a fraction of a second went blank. A flicker of pure animal panic in her eyes before the mask of grief slammed back down. She hadn't prepared for this question. They couldn't," she stammered. her voice dropping to a theatrical tragic whisper. Martha, the car, the fire, there was nothing left to take. They identified him from the dental records in his travel kit. It was that fast. My blood ran cold, but not with grief. With a chilling professional suspicion. Dental records? In an hour? On a multi-car pileup on a major interstate. The idea was so preposterous, so logistically impossible, that it was almost laughable. It takes days, sometimes weeks, to get a forensic dental identification, especially in a chaotic multi-casualty incident. She was improvising, and she was doing it badly. I see, I said, letting my own face crumble into a mask of fresh profound horror, a performance to cover the cold hard certainty that was now forming in my mind. I spent the next hour asking more questions, each one a gentle grief-stricken probe designed to test the limits of her lie. I asked for Trooper Smith's badge number. She couldn't remember it. I asked for the precinct he was calling from. She didn't know. I asked for the name of the coroner who had made the dental record identification. She burst into a fresh and very convenient torrent of tears. Every answer was a vague emotional deflection. Every detail was a flimsy, poorly constructed piece of fiction. As a detective, I had interviewed hundreds of people in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy. I knew what real grief looked like. It was messy. It was contradictory. It was filled with a desperate, obsessive need for the very facts that Izzy was so skillfully avoiding. Her grief was too perfect, too linear, too much like a scene from a movie. By the time she left, promising to handle all the arrangements and to protect me from the awful details, the terrible and deeply, deeply monstrous suspicion in my mind had hardened into an almost certainty. My son was not dead, but something was terribly, terribly wrong, and my daughter-in-law, the beautiful grieving widow, was at the very center of it. The very next day Izzy returned. She was no longer performing the role of the frantic grieving widow. She was now performing a different, and far more chilling role. The cool, efficient, and deeply concerned caregiver, taking charge of a sad and difficult situation. She wore a severe but elegant black dress, her hair pulled back in a tight chignon. She was here to manage me. She found me in the study, surrounded by photo albums of David, my performance of the shattered mother now in its second act. Martha, she began, her voice a soft pitying purr, we need to talk about the future, about what's best for you. She spoke of my frail state, of my sudden tragic vulnerability. She spoke of the dangers of an old woman with a heart condition, now consumed by grief, living alone in a large empty house. It's just not safe, Martha, she said, her eyes full of a deep and deeply false concern. So, she continued, her voice all business now, I've taken the liberty of making some arrangements. There's a wonderful facility, the Willows, just on the other side of town. It's a long-term care community. It's beautiful. They have a wonderful medical staff, activities. You'll be safe there. You'll be taken care of. I stared at her, my mind reeling. A nursing home. She was trying to have me committed. Then came the ultimatum, the final brutal and deeply illuminating move in her monstrous game. The funeral, she said as if discussing a social engagement, is in 4 days, a small private service. It's what David would have wanted. She paused, then delivered the line, her voice as cold and as sharp as a shard of ice. After that you have 4 days to get out. The words, so stark, so brutal, so utterly devoid of any human decency, hung in the silent, sunlit room. 4 days. She was giving me a woman who had just been told her only son was dead. A handful of days for my grief before I was to be evicted from my own home. Get out? I whispered, my voice a perfect imitation of a confused, broken old woman. It's for the best, Martha, she said, her voice softening again into that infuriating, pitying purr. The house, it's too much for you to manage. And frankly, we need to sell it. We need the money to settle David's affairs. He had some debts. The estate needs to be liquidated. And there it was. The motive. The why that my detective's mind had been searching for. It was about the house. It was about the money. This beautiful grief-stricken performance was not a tragedy. It was a real estate transaction. She stood up, her work done. The movers will be here on Tuesday morning, she said, as if the matter were already settled. They'll pack up your important things. Don't you worry about a thing. I'll handle everything. She left, a black-clad angel of mercy, having just delivered a death sentence to my life as I knew it. But the moment the front door closed behind her, the mask of the grieving, frail and broken mother dropped. The ultimatum had been delivered, and the investigation, my final and most important case, had just officially begun. The moment I heard the sound of her car pulling away from the curb, the frail 72-year-old widow, Martha Evans, ceased to exist. In her place stood Detective Evans, retired, perhaps, but with a mind as sharp and as hungry for the truth as it had ever been. My grief for my son was real, a deep, aching chasm in my soul, but it was now intertwined with a cold, clear and absolute certainty that he was not dead. He was in trouble, and my first and only priority was to find him. My first move was not to a phone, but to a place of my past. I went to the back of the deep closet in my study, a closet filled with old case files and memorabilia from my 30-year career. Behind a row of old framed commendations I found a heavy steel lockbox. I brought the box to my desk. My hands, which had been performing a convincing tremor for the past 24 hours, were now rock steady. I spun the combination lock, the familiar clicks a comforting, mechanical rhythm. I opened the lid. Inside was the arsenal of my old life, the tools not of a grieving mother, but of a hunter. There was my old service-issue Glock, which I had no intention of using, but whose familiar heavy weight was a comfort. And beneath it, the tools I really needed, a set of high-fidelity, micro-cassette recorders, a small but powerful digital voice recorder, disguised as a pen, a set of lock-picking tools, and a small leather-bound notebook, filled with the private unlisted numbers of the network of cops, informants and courthouse clerks I had spent a lifetime cultivating. I took out the digital voice recorder, the pen, I checked its battery, it was fully charged. This would be my primary weapon. I knew with an absolute certainty that Izzy would be back. She would be back to manage me, to finalize the arrangements, to get me to sign the papers that would give her control of my life, and my house. And when she came, I would be ready. The hunt for the truth, and for my son, had begun. I was no longer a victim, waiting for the end. I was a detective, back on the case, and it was the most important, and the most personal case of my life. My strategy was simple. I had to let Izzy believe her plan was working. I had to play the part of the confused, grieving and increasingly pliable old woman, so that she would become comfortable, careless, and I hoped conversational. I waited a few hours, then I made the call. I took out the digital voice recorder, the pen, and clicked the top, the tiny, almost invisible blue light blinking once to confirm it was recording. I then dialed her number, my finger deliberately a little shaky. "Izzy, my dear," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of a frail, heartbroken old woman, full of a pathetic, quavering confusion. "It's Martha. I'm a little confused. About the funeral, you said it was private, but I need to make sure everything is right for my boy. What's the name of the funeral home? I'd like to call them just to talk about the flowers." It was the perfect bait. A simple, sentimental and deeply, deeply believable request from a grieving mother. "Oh, Martha," she said, her voice a smooth, pitying sigh, the sound of a busy, important person dealing with a tiresome, emotional subordinate. "You don't need to worry about that. I told you I'm handling everything. It's the Evergreen Mortuary on the east side, but they have all my instructions. You don't need to call them." "Evergreen Mortuary," I repeated, my voice a mumble, as if I were writing it down. "And the burial? Where will he be?" "We're having him cremated, Martha," she said, her voice a little too quick. "It's simpler. It's what he would have wanted." Another lie. David and I had had that conversation. After his father had died, he was terrified of fire. He had made me promise half-jokingly, but with a core of real, genuine fear, that he would be buried next to his father. "Oh," I said, my voice a small, wounded sound. I didn't know." I kept her on the phone for another 10 minutes, asking a series of small, rambling and seemingly pointless questions about the service, about the death certificate, about the non-existent police report, and with each question she built her prison of lies a little higher, a little more detailed, a little more damning. She spoke of the lovely, understanding funeral director, Mr. Gable. She spoke of the beautiful, simple urn she had chosen. She spoke of the tragic but heroic state trooper who had been so kind to her on the phone. And I recorded it all. Every lie, every contradiction, every perfect, polished and utterly, completely fraudulent detail of her beautiful, monstrous and now fully documented fiction. When I hung up, I clicked the top of the pen recorder. The small blue light blinked once. The evidence was secure. The first and most crucial thread of her lie had been captured. Now it was time to pull on it. My next call was to a number that was not in my regular phone book. It was a number from my old leather-bound notebook. A number I knew by heart. It was the private unlisted cell phone of a man named Marcus Williams. My former partner, a man who now held a senior position in the department. We had come up through the ranks together, had worked 100 brutal soul-crushing cases side by side. We had a bond that was deeper than friendship. We were brothers, forged in the fires of a shared and often terrible history. He answered on the first ring. "Martha," he said, his voice a low, familiar rumble. "No, hello, no preamble. I was sorry to hear about your boy. The whole department is talking about it. A terrible, terrible tragedy." So, the lie had already spread. Izzy had been busy. "That's what I'm calling about, Marcus," I said, my voice low and urgent. "I need a favor, an off-the-books for an old friend. Kind of favor, and it needs to be absolutely completely silent." "You name it," he said, his loyalty absolute. No questions asked. "I need you to run a check for me," I said, quietly. "I need to know if there have been any traffic fatalities on the I-5 south of Seattle in the last 48 hours involving a male late 30s driving a silver Lexus sedan. License plate number." I gave him David's plate number, a number that was as familiar to me as my own name. "And," I continued, "I need you to do a quiet, digital sweep of the impound lots in that jurisdiction. See if the car has been reported." There was a moment of silence on his end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his old detective's mind. He was not just hearing a request. He was hearing a suspicion. He was hearing the voice of a woman who did not believe her own son was dead. "I'll make some calls," he said, his voice now a low, professional murmur. "I'll have to be careful, but I know a guy in the state patrol up there. I'll get back to you." He called me back an hour later. "Martha," he said, and his voice was a mixture of confusion and a dawning terrible understanding. "You're not going to believe this. I had my guy run a full search of the state database. There have been no fatalities on that stretch of the I-5 in the last 72 hours. Not a single one." My heart, which had been a cold hard knot in my chest, gave a single powerful and deeply, deeply relieved thud. "And the car?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "Nothing," he said. "It's not in any impound lot in the state of Washington. It hasn't been reported stolen. As far as the official record is concerned, your son's car and your son have not been involved in any kind of incident, anywhere." The confirmation was a beautiful, terrible thing. The official record, the world of facts and data, had just confirmed what my gut, my detective's instinct had been telling me all along. The car accident was a lie. The funeral was a lie. My son was not dead. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I could not name. "Martha," he said, his voice low and serious. "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'm going to need your help again. The official kind." I now knew the what. The car accident was a fabrication. Now I needed the why. What could possibly motivate a woman to fake her own husband's death, to lie to his grieving mother and to try and have her evicted from her own home? The answer, as it almost always was in the thousands of cases I had investigated over my career, was simple: money. My son David was a financial advisor. A successful one, I had always believed. He and Izzy lived a life of quiet, but undeniable luxury. A beautiful modern home in the city's most expensive neighborhood, 2 new leased German cars in the driveway, lavish, exotic vacations that they documented on their social media with a kind of relentless performative joy. I had always assumed that their lifestyle was the product of David's success. He was my son after all. I wanted to believe in his competence, in his brilliance, but my detective's mind, now fully awakened and deeply suspicious, began to question that assumption. I began my own quiet, financial investigation. It was not a high-tech illegal hack. It was old-school shoe-leather detective work, using the skills and contacts I had spent a lifetime acquiring. I started with a simple public records search, and the first gaping crack in their beautiful financial facade immediately appeared. Their house, the magnificent glass and steel monument to their success, was in pre-foreclosure. They had missed their last 3 mortgage payments. The discovery was a jolt. I then made a call to an old and not entirely reputable contact of mine, a private investigator who specialized in asset and liability searches. I gave him David's and Izzy's names, and I asked him to dig. The report he emailed me 2 days later was a horror story. It was a portrait of a life lived on a mountain of catastrophic and deeply, deeply secret debt. David's career, it turned out, had not just stalled, it had imploded. A series of high-risk and, as the investigator hinted, borderline illegal investments had gone bad, wiping out not just his own capital but a significant amount of his clients' money. He was not just broke, he was facing professional ruin and very likely criminal charges. They were living on a lifeline of high-interest credit cards, of personal loans, of a frantic, desperate juggling of debt that was, as the report made clear, about to come to a crashing and very public end. And then, I found the final and most illuminating piece of the puzzle. My investigator had found a recent loan application that had been denied. It was an application for a large unsecured line of credit, and in the section for assets, David had listed one single significant and very liquid asset, an asset he did not own. He had listed expected inheritance from mother's estate, including primary residence at 450 Crestview Drive. He had valued my home, my property, at its current and very substantial market value. The motive was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact written in black and white on a bank's loan application. They were not just trying to take my house, they were trying to cash it in, they were trying to use the future, and in their minds the imminent value of my estate, to save themselves from their present ruin. And the only thing standing in the way of that expected inheritance was me, a healthy and very much alive 72-year-old woman. The monstrous and now terrifyingly logical shape of their plan was complete. They needed me out of the way, and the quickest and most efficient way to do that was to have me declared a grieving, incompetent old woman, and to have my son, the heir to my estate, declared dead. The knowledge of my son's financial ruin, and of the monstrous, desperate lie he and his wife were perpetrating, was a heavy, indigestible stone in my gut. But it was still a theory, a well-supported and deeply, deeply convincing theory, but a theory nonetheless. I needed proof. I needed to see him. I needed to know with my own 2 eyes that my son was alive. The investigator's report had given me one final and very crucial piece of information. In his desperate final days before his death, David had been liquidating every small asset he had. He had sold his expensive watch. He had sold a small collection of art he had inherited from his father, and he had, in a final pathetic act of a desperate man, sold his beloved vintage sports car, a car he had spent a decade restoring, for cash. The buyer, the investigator had noted, was a man with a known association to the city's criminal underworld. And the transaction had not taken place at a bank. It had taken place in the parking lot of a seedy pay-by-the-week motel on the far industrial side of town. The Starlight Inn. It was a long shot, a detective's hunch, but it was the only lead I had. That night, I got in my old, unremarkable sedan, a car that had served me well for 15 years, and I drove to the Starlight Inn. It was a place that time and hope had forgotten. A flickering neon sign cast a sickly pink glow on a collection of shabby single-story buildings. It was a place for people who were hiding, for people who did not want to be found. I parked across the street, in the shadows of a derelict warehouse, and I waited. I was a detective again, on a stakeout. The hours ticked by, the night was cold, a fine misting rain beginning to fall. I sat in the darkness, my gaze fixed on the rows of anonymous numbered doors, my heart a heavy aching weight in my chest. And then, just after 2 in the morning, I saw him. A door to one of the rooms, number 17, opened, spilling a weak yellow light into the damp, dark parking lot. A man emerged, a lonely, hunched figure, and stood under the small covered walkway to light a cigarette. It was David. My son. He was not the handsome, confident, successful financial advisor from the family photos. He was a ghost. He was pale, gaunt, his expensive clothes looking rumpled and slept in. His eyes, even from across the street, looked haunted, terrified. He smoked the cigarette with a frantic, desperate intensity, his gaze darting around the empty, rain-slicked parking lot, as if he were expecting an attack at any moment. He was not dead. He was in hiding. He was a prisoner in a cheap motel room. A man who had faked his own death to escape the consequences of his own life. The sight of him, so broken, so lost, so utterly, completely, a shadow of the son I had raised, was a blow more profound than any lie Izzy could have ever told me. The relief, the profound and deeply joyous relief of seeing my son alive, was immediately and completely overwhelmed by the profound and soul-crushing grief of seeing what he had become. I did not get out of the car. I did not call his name. I just sat there in the darkness and I watched my living, breathing, and completely and utterly lost son until he finished his cigarette, threw it into a puddle and disappeared back into the darkness of his room. The confirmation of the central lie was complete. Now it was time to make the official call. The next morning I did not call my old partner Marcus. This was no longer a matter for an off-the-books favor from a friend. This was now an official police matter, a complex and deeply, deeply ugly crime that required a specific and very specialized kind of investigator. I drove to the downtown police headquarters, a building I had not set foot in since my retirement party 5 years ago. I walked through the familiar chaotic hustle of the lobby, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant, a strange nostalgic perfume that brought back a lifetime of memories, both good and bad. I did not go to the main desk. I went directly to the third floor, to a quiet, unassuming suite of offices that housed a unit I had helped to create in the final years of my career, the Elder Abuse and Financial Crimes Division. I asked the desk sergeant, a young woman with a sharp, intelligent face, for a specific person, a man I had not seen in years, but whose career I had followed with a quiet maternal pride. "I need to speak with Detective Barnes," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "My name is Martha Evans. Tell him it's the captain." Detective David Barnes was a man I had mentored when he was a rookie, a sharp, no-nonsense cop with a keen mind and a deep, unshakable sense of justice. That was, in this line of work, a rare and precious thing. I had seen the spark in him from the very beginning. He was, I knew, the right man for this case. He came out to the lobby himself, his face a mixture of surprise, of pleasure at seeing his old mentor, and of a deep and immediate concern at seeing me here, in this place, looking like a woman who had the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Captain," he said, still using my old title, his handshake firm and respectful. "It's good to see you, ma'am, but I wish it were under better circumstances. I was so sorry to hear about your son. The whole department sends their condolences." "That's what I'm here to talk about, Detective," I said, my voice low and serious. "I need a few minutes of your time, in private. And what I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane." We sat in his small, cluttered and blessedly private office. The walls were covered with case files, with crime scene photos, with the chaotic, ugly detritus of a life spent in the pursuit of bad men. And for the next hour, I laid out the entire unbelievable case. I did not present it as a grieving, hysterical mother. I presented it as a retired homicide detective, briefing a colleague on a new and very active investigation. I started with the news of David's death, and the immediate glaring inconsistencies in Izzy's story. I told him about the lack of any official record of a crash, a death or a car, the fact I knew he could, and would verify himself within minutes. I then laid out the motive. I gave him the file from my private investigator, the one that detailed David's and Izzy's catastrophic financial ruin, their foreclosure, their mountain of secret debt. I showed him the denied loan application, the one that listed my own home as an expected inheritance, a clear and damning piece of evidence of their intent. And finally, I took out my phone. I placed it on the desk between us, a small, modern and deeply, deeply powerful piece of technology. "And this," I said, "is the final piece. This is a recording of a conversation I had with my daughter-in-law yesterday, in which she, with a calm and deeply chilling clarity, describes the details of her own husband's fake funeral." I pressed play, and I watched as Detective Barnes's face, which had begun the meeting in a state of polite, professional and deeply, deeply skeptical concern, slowly and completely transformed into a mask of cold, hard and deeply, deeply angry belief. Detective Barnes listened to the entire chilling recording without saying a single word. His face, which had been a mask of professional neutrality, slowly hardened into a block of granite. He listened to my faint, grief-stricken, quavering questions. He listened to Izzy's smooth, confident and utterly, completely, damningly false answers. He listened to her describe the non-existent state trooper with the common name of Smith. He listened to her describe the fictional funeral director, Mr. Gable, at the Evergreen Mortuary. He listened to her describe the impossible, instantaneous dental record identification. When the recording ended, a profound and deeply professionally angry silence settled over the small, cluttered office. Detective Barnes just sat there for a long moment, his gaze fixed on my phone as if it were a venomous snake he was about to bag. "I've been in this unit for 5 years, Captain," he finally said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, the sound of a good cop who has just been presented with a truly spectacularly bad guy. I've seen some monstrous things. Children defrauding their own elderly parents out of their life savings. Caregivers starving their patients to steal their pension checks. But this, to fake a son's death, to his own mother, a retired and decorated police captain, for a house. This is a new level of pure unadulterated evil. This is personal. The skepticism was gone, replaced by the cold, hard, and deeply satisfyingly righteous fury that I knew so well, the fury that had fueled my own career for 30 years. So what's the play? He asked, his mind already shifting from the horror of the evidence to the practicalities of the action. We have enough here, more than enough, to bring her in for questioning, to get a warrant for her financials, to start a full-blown investigation, but she'll just lawyer up, she'll deny everything. She'll say you're a confused, grieving old woman, who is imagining things, who is lashing out in her pain. It could get messy, it could get public, and your son, he'll be caught in the middle of it. I have a different idea, I said. My own mind, my old detective's mind, already 3 steps ahead, having spent the last 2 days planning this very conversation. She has a plan, a timeline. The fake funeral is in 2 days. The movers are scheduled to arrive at my house 4 days after that. She believes I am completely and utterly under her control. She believes I am a broken, grieving, and easily manipulated old woman. And I think, I said, a slow, cold, and deeply satisfyingly strategic smile touching my lips for the first time in a week, that we should let her continue to believe that. I laid out my own plan, a quiet, strategic, and deeply, deeply personal trap, a final piece of theater designed to catch a master performer in her own, undeniable and very public final act. I want to catch her in the act, I said, the undeniable, irrefutable act of trying to physically and financially displace me based on the lie of my son's death. I want her to walk into a situation she cannot possibly talk her way out of. Detective Barnes listened, a slow, appreciative, and deeply, deeply professional smile spreading across his own face. He was not just a cop, he was a student of the game. He had learned from me years ago, and he was recognizing the work of a master. A sting operation, he said, his eyes shining with a hunter's glee. With you as the bait. It's risky, Martha. It's unorthodox. It's the only way to get a clean conviction, I said. And it's the only way to get my son out of whatever hell he's in, to give him a chance to tell the truth. And so, in that small cluttered office on the 3rd floor of the police headquarters, a new and very powerful alliance was formed. This was no longer just a retired detective's private off-the-books investigation. This was now a sanctioned, if highly unorthodox, police operation. A final quiet collaboration between an old captain and her best detective. Okay, Captain, Detective Barnes said, standing up and extending his hand, the formal title, a mark of his profound and renewed respect. Let's do it your way. Let's let her play out her little drama. But when the final act comes, my people will be there to bring down the curtain. The trap was set, the alliance was formed, and I, the frail, grieving old woman, was about to play the most important and the most dangerous role of my life. The funeral was the most surreal, and the most deeply, profoundly painful piece of theater I have ever had to endure. It was held on a Thursday morning at the Evergreen Mortuary, a small, slightly shabby establishment on the far industrial side of town, a place I was certain Izzy had chosen for its anonymity and its cheapness. The air inside smelled of stale potpourri and a deep, cloying chemical sweetness. I arrived with a small funereal bouquet of white roses, my face a mask of tragic maternal grief that required very little acting. Izzy was there at the door to greet me. She was a vision in a simple but very expensive black designer dress, her face a perfect, beautiful mask of sorrowful dignity. She was the grieving widow, the stoic, beautiful, and utterly, completely fraudulent centerpiece of this entire monstrous charade. The service was held in a small, windowless chapel, its walls a depressing shade of beige. There were perhaps a dozen other mourners in attendance, a collection of sad, generic-looking people I had never seen before in my life. They sat scattered in the pews, their heads bowed, their expressions a study in practiced professional solemnity. They were, I knew with a cold absolute certainty, not friends of David's. They were extras, hired for the day from some local down-market casting agency, paid $100 each to sit in a pew for an hour and look appropriately somber. The casket at the front of the room, a cheap particle board box draped in a black cloth, was closed. Of course it was. It was, I was sure, completely and utterly and almost comically empty. The service was a masterpiece of vague impersonal platitudes. The funeral director, a nervous sweating man with a cheap suit and a shifty gaze, who looked more like a used car salesman than a man of God, and whom I was certain Izzy had paid a substantial off-the-books cash fee to for this performance, stood at a small lectern and spoke of a life cut tragically short. He did not use David's name. He did not share a single personal anecdote. He did not know any. He spoke of a beloved husband, a cherished friend, a man of great promise. His words a generic fill-in-the-blanks eulogy that could have been about anyone and was in fact about no one. Izzy, the grieving widow, sat in the front row, a black lace veil covering her beautiful lying face. She held a handkerchief to her eyes. Her shoulders shook with what were, I'm sure, completely and utterly fake, and very well-rehearsed sobs. I, the grieving mother, sat beside her playing my own terrible part. I drew on every ounce of my 30 years of experience as a detective, of having to deliver death notices to the families of victims, of having to sit with them in their raw, chaotic and deeply, deeply authentic grief, of knowing, intimately, the true, raw and ugly face of loss. I bowed my head. I let my own real tears not for a son who was dead, but for a son who was lost, for a son who had allowed this desecration of our family to happen, fall freely. I was in that moment the most convincing actor in the room, because my grief, unlike theirs, was devastatingly and profoundly real. After the service, which lasted a mercifully short 15 minutes, Izzy, the brave, stoic widow, stood at the back of the chapel and received the condolences of the hired mourners. They would shuffle past, pat her hand, murmur some empty generic phrase, like "so sorry for your loss," and then slip quietly out the back, their day's work complete, their $100 fee earned. Izzy came to me, her hand on my arm, her face a mask of shared tragic loss. "It was a beautiful service, wasn't it, Martha?" she said, her voice a soft, tragic whisper. "He's at peace now." "Yes, my dear," I said, my own voice a choked, heartbroken sob that was only partly an act. "He is." I endured it all. The empty casket, the hired mourners, the fake tears, the profound and deeply desecrating lie of it all. It was the most difficult and the most necessary performance of my life. And it was, I knew, the final crucial piece of the puzzle. Izzy, in her arrogant, triumphant, and completely and utterly fraudulent grief, was now completely and utterly convinced that her plan was working flawlessly. She had no idea that her every move was being watched, that her every lie was being recorded, and that her own very real and very public funeral was just a few short days away. The 4 days between the fake funeral and the eviction were the longest, and the quietest of my life. I was a woman living in a ghost story, a ghost in my own home, a character in a play that was reaching its final, terrible and deeply satisfying, climax. I was a prisoner, a patient, and a hunter, all at the same time. I followed Izzy's instructions to the letter. Or rather, I performed the role of a woman who was following them. I packed. I went through the house, room by room, my home of 40 years, and I packed a few small sentimental suitcases. The task was a strange and deeply sorrowful one. Each object I touched was a memory, a piece of my life with Samuel, with David. I packed my late husband's photo albums, the smiling happy faces from a life that now seemed a distant impossible dream. I packed my old service revolver, my companion through 30 years of a dangerous and difficult career, which I cleaned and oiled with a slow, deliberate and almost meditative care. It was a ritual of a past life, a life where I was the one in control, the one who brought order to the chaos. I packed the framed commendations from my career, the symbols of a life of honor and service, a life that was now being so dishonorably, so completely dismantled. I was packing up a life, my life, and the act, even though it was a performance, felt strange and sad, and deeply, deeply final. I did not pack the furniture, the beautiful, solid and well-loved pieces Samuel and I had collected over a lifetime. I did not pack the art, the small but precious collection of paintings we had bought together. I did not pack the thousands of books that lined the walls of my study, a silent, paper and ink testament to a life of the mind. I left the house as it was, a silent, waiting stage, ready for the final scene. On the morning of the final day, the day the movers were scheduled to arrive, the day I was to be formally and finally evicted from my own home, I made one final and very important call. The pen recorder was active, its tiny blue light blinking once in the dim morning light of my study. "Izzy, my dear," I said, my voice a perfect quavering imitation of a frail, confused old woman. The movers, they are coming this morning? Yes, Martha, she said, her voice a mixture of impatience and a final weary sigh of a job almost complete. At 10, I told you this, are you ready? I am, I said. I have my bags packed, and, Izzy, I just wanted to say thank you, for handling everything. You have been so strong, I don't know what I would have done without you. It was the final perfect and most disgusting lie of my performance. Of course, Martha, she said, her voice softening, her ego soothed, her victory now complete. I'll be there at 10, to supervise. Just be ready. I will, I said and hung up. I then made my second call. Barnes, I said, when the detective answered. It's today. She'll be here at 10. Are we ready? We're ready, Captain, he said, his voice a low, confident hum of pure professional readiness. My team is in position, 2 unmarked cars, 1 at each end of the street. We have eyes on the house. We'll move in on your signal. There will be no signal, I said, my voice now losing its quaver, becoming the cold, hard voice of the captain. You will move in when I tell you to, not before. I need her to complete the act. I need her to take the keys. I need her to believe she has won. Do you understand? Understood, Martha, he said, his voice now a low and deeply respectful murmur. We'll wait for your word. Good luck. And so I waited. I sat on my front porch, in the old wicker rocking chair that had been my husband's favorite, and I waited. I had placed my 3 sad little suitcases by the front door, a pathetic tangible symbol of my defeat. I was dressed in a simple, old and slightly shabby cardigan, a pair of worn corduroy trousers. I was the very picture of a defeated, broken old woman, waiting to be taken away to a nursing home, waiting for the end of her life. I was the perfect bait, a frail, grieving and utterly completely harmless old woman, sitting on her front porch, waiting for the final and most profound humiliation of her life. The sun was warm on my face. It was a beautiful day for a reckoning. At precisely 10 o'clock, a sleek, black and deeply arrogant-looking BMW, a car I knew was leased, and whose payments were, according to my investigator's report, 3 months overdue, pulled into my driveway. The engine, a loud, aggressive roar in the quiet suburban morning, was cut, and a moment later Izzy and David got out. Izzy was a vision of somber, corporate efficiency. She wore a sharp, black pantsuit, her face a mask of cool, professional sympathy, a look she had likely perfected while closing deals on million-dollar homes. She was not here as a grieving daughter-in-law. She was here as a real estate agent, about to take possession of a very valuable and very personal piece of property. She was triumphant, her face alight with the victory she believed she had so cleverly, so ruthlessly secured. And David, my son, he was a ghost, a pale, hollowed-out and utterly, completely broken-looking man. He wore a rumpled suit that hung on his now thinner frame. His eyes were red-rimmed and sleepless, and they were fixed on the ground, on his own expensive, and no doubt, soon to be repossessed, Italian leather shoes. He would not look at me. He was a man being haunted by his own living mother. Izzy strode up the walkway to the porch, her high heels clicking a sharp, impatient and deeply satisfyingly final rhythm on the stone. She was the conqueror, arriving to claim her prize, to plant her flag on this newly acquired territory. Good morning, Martha, she said, her voice a smooth, pitying purr, the voice of a person who has won so completely, so absolutely that they can now afford to be magnanimous, to be kind. I see you're all packed and ready. That's good. It makes things easier. She looked at my 3 pathetic suitcases by the door, and a small, almost imperceptible smirk of pure triumphant satisfaction touched her lips. The car from the Willows will be here in an hour, she continued, her voice all business now. A project manager outlining the final logistical steps of a successful project. They have instructions to take you, and your things, directly there. I've already handled all the paperwork with their admissions office. You're all checked in. She held out her hand, her long, elegant, and deeply greedy fingers outstretched. I'll need the keys, Martha, she said, her voice a soft, but utterly, completely and finally non-negotiable command. The house keys, the car keys, the key to the safe deposit box at the bank. All of them. This was it. This was the moment. The final and most damning act of the crime. The physical, tangible and legally indisputable act of taking possession of my property, of my life. based on the monstrous and now fully documented lie of my son's death. I looked at her outstretched hand, at her beautiful, triumphant, and utterly, completely soulless face, and then I looked past her to my son, who was still standing by the car, a weeping, silent, and utterly, completely pathetic statue of a man, his shoulders shaking with a grief that was not for his dead mother, but for his own, very much alive, and very, very lost soul. "It's time to go, Martha," she said, her voice now a little sharper, a little more impatient, a flicker of the iron fist beneath the velvet glove. "Give me the keys." The trap was about to be sprung. The performance was over. The reckoning was here. I did not move. I did not reach for my pocket. I simply looked at her outstretched, impatient hand, and I let the silence stretch. I let her stand there in her moment of ultimate and very temporary triumph, for a few long and deeply, deeply satisfying seconds. And then, I spoke. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but in the silent sunlit morning it had the force of a gunshot. It was as hard and as solid, and as unmovable as a block of granite. Her confident, triumphant smile faltered. A flicker of confused, irritated annoyance flashed in her eyes. This was not part of the script. The broken, grieving old woman was not following her lines. "What?" she said, her voice sharp. "Martha, don't be difficult. I told you it's all been arranged. The car is on its way." "I know what you told me, Isabel," I said, using her full name for the first time, a small but significant reassertion of my own power, a reclaiming of the narrative. "And I know what you have done." And as I spoke, as if on a silent cinematic cue, two unmarked, dark blue and deeply, deeply official-looking police cars glided silently to the curb, one in front of her car, one behind, boxing in the black, and now suddenly very trapped-looking BMW. The car doors opened, and four men got out. They were not in uniform. They were in the quiet, serious, and utterly, completely intimidating dark suits of plainclothes detectives. One of them, a man whose face I knew better than my own, my old protégé, Detective Barnes, stepped forward. Izzy froze. Her hand, which had been outstretched, fell to her side. Her face, which had been a mask of triumphant, pitying confidence, was now a mask of pure, uncomprehending, and deeply, deeply satisfyingly panicked shock. She looked from the arriving police cars to my face, which was no longer the face of a grieving, broken, old woman, but the face of a retired, and very, very angry, homicide detective, who had just finally, and completely closed her last, and most important case, and she finally, and far, far too late, understood. This was not an eviction. This was a sting. This was a trap, and she was not the victor. She was the prey. The police had not just arrived. They had been invited, and the party, her party, the celebration of her own cleverness, was over. "Isabel Henderson," Detective Barnes said, his voice cold, official, and utterly, completely devoid of any sympathy. He had stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his presence a calm and utterly unshakable wall of legal authority, the living, breathing embodiment of the consequences she had never, not once, believed would arrive. "My name is Detective Barnes, with the City Police Department's Elder Abuse and Financial Crimes Unit. We have a few questions for you." Izzy stared at him, her mind so quick, so clever, so adept at spinning lies and manipulating realities, now completely and utterly short-circuited. "Questions? What questions?" "There must be some mistake," she stammered, her voice a high, thin, and deeply unconvincing squeak, the automatic, reflexive denial of a person who has been caught and knows it. She turned to me, her eyes a blaze of panic, desperate fury, searching for a way, any way, to regain control of the narrative, to flip the script. "Martha, what is this? What have you done? You called them, after everything I've done for you." "I have done nothing, Isabel," I said, my voice as cold and as hard as the stone of the porch beneath my feet. "You, on the other hand, have done a great many things. You have faked my son's death. You have held a fake funeral, and you have just now attempted to fraudulently seize my property based on that lie. I believe that's what the detective has some questions about." She began to protest, to launch into a new and very frantic performance, the role of the innocent, misunderstood, and deeply, deeply wronged woman, the victim of a senile old woman's grief-stricken delusions. "This is insane. The old woman is crazy. She's grieving. She's not in her right mind. She's the one who should be investigated. She's been harassing me." But Detective Barnes was not interested in her performance. His audience was not a group of easily manipulated family members. It was the justice system. He simply looked at me, a silent, professional question in his eyes. I stood up from my rocking chair, a slow and deeply satisfying unfolding of my old tired bones. I took out my phone, the same phone I had used to record her beautiful, monstrous, and now deeply, deeply damning lies. "You are a very convincing actress, Isabel," I said, my voice a low and very, very satisfied murmur. "But your performance has one fatal flaw. We have a recording of you in your own very convincing voice, planning your own husband's fake funeral." I pressed play, and in the quiet, sunlit suburban morning, my daughter-in-law's own voice, a smooth, confident, and utterly chillingly clear sound filled the air. "It's the Evergreen Mortuary on the east side, but they have all my instructions. You don't need to call them. We're having him cremated, Martha. It's simpler. It's what he would have wanted." Her own words, her own lies echoed in the quiet street, a public and utterly irrefutable confession of her crime. The color drained from her face, she stared at the phone at the sound of her own treacherous voice, and her beautiful lying mouth fell open in a silent, perfect and deeply, deeply satisfying, pure unadulterated and very, very final horror. The unraveling was complete. The case was closed. The sound of his wife's recorded voice, the cold, hard and undeniable proof of their monstrous and now very public conspiracy, was the final blow that shattered the fragile, terrified silence of my son. As the recording played, its terrible, cheerful, and utterly damning words echoing in the quiet morning air, David, who had been standing by the car like a pale, hollowed-out ghost, a silent, unwilling spectator to the implosion of his own life, finally and completely collapsed. He did not just fall, he seemed to implode, his legs giving way beneath him as if his very bones had dissolved into dust. He fell to his knees on the manicured green grass of my front lawn, the same lawn he had played on as a boy, and his head fell into his hands, a sound, a raw, guttural, and utterly heartbreakingly broken sound, a sound of pure animalistic grief and shame, tore from his throat. He began to sob, not the quiet, dignified tears of a grieving man, but the wild, ragged, and uncontrollable wails of a lost child who has finally and completely understood the terrible, terrible nature of what he has done. "I'm sorry," he wept, the words a choked, almost unintelligible litany of despair. "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to. She made me. The money. I lost everything. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. I'm so sorry." Confronted by me, his mother, the woman he had betrayed in the most profound and monstrous way imaginable. Confronted by the police, the embodiment of the law and order he had so spectacularly and so completely violated, and confronted by the undeniable, recorded proof of their conspiracy, the last thin and brittle thread of his own complicity, of his own will to continue the lie, finally and completely snapped. The confession, a torrent of guilt, of fear, of a profound and deeply pathetic self-loathing, came pouring out. He confessed everything, the catastrophic, and very likely illegal, investments that had led to his financial ruin, the mountain of debt he had hidden from me, from the world, the threats from Izzy, her monstrous and in his mind, his only way out. Izzy, for her part, just stood there, her face a mask of silent, venomous fury. She was not looking at her weeping, broken husband, the man whose life she had just destroyed. She was looking at me. Her eyes, her beautiful, cold and utterly, completely soulless eyes, were filled with a pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the look of a predator who has been outsmarted, of a con artist who has been conned, of a person who has lost everything and is looking for someone to blame, and has found them. Detective Barnes and his team moved in. They helped my weeping, broken son to his feet. They read Izzy her rights, her face a mask of cold, hard and utterly unrepentant rage as they snapped the handcuffs on her wrists. They led her away, a beautiful, elegant and now utterly, completely ruined woman, a woman who had gambled everything and had lost it all. I stood in the doorway of my home, my house, a house that was still and would now always be mine. I watched them take her away, and then I looked at my son, my broken, my weeping, my weak, my foolish and my very, very much alive son. The long, difficult and deeply, deeply uncertain process of seeking justice, and perhaps one day, a long, long time from now, forgiveness, had just begun.